This is Chapter 8, The Child with Endocrine Dysfunction. So what is the endocrine system? This is the system that controls all of the body's metabolic processes. And there are glands throughout the body. And if you remember, endocrine glands secrete hormones. A hormone is a substance secreted by one gland, but its effects are on a different organ or system or part of the body. And here's a picture of the endocrine system, kind of showing the different glands and the different systems that are affected then by the hormones that are secreted. So we're going to look at some of those hormones, of both too much and too little of them. And we're going to start with the pituitary gland. So if you have hypopituitarism, you do not make enough growth hormone. So before we treat this, we need to make sure this child really does have subnormal growth hormone. So we're going to do labs to see that somatotropin is low. And this is not just a short family or a family where everybody grew really late. So we need to first, make sure it's not just a familial pattern. And then if it is a low growth hormone, we're going to replace it with growth hormone. And this is given in a daily injection at bedtime. And it's given from the time we figure out this child is deficient in growth hormone until they have no growth left in their bones. So it's every day at bedtime, and it's expensive. But it works quite well. So we're going to give it until the epiphyseal growth plates of the long bones are closed, because then there's no more ability to make this child grow. Realize these hormones are all, they interact with each other, and so if one is off, we need to check the others and make sure that they're not off as well. So this is how we figure out if the child still has growth left. We look at the growth plate. You can see in the wrist here, this child, there's a gap here. You can see that epiphyseal growth plate. It's still open. And over here, it's not. A really young child, you'll not only see the growth plate here, but you'll see big gaps between the bones in the wrist. And that will tell us that there's still growth. And so that growth hormone will make the child grow. So the prognosis for these kids is really good. 80 to 90% of the time, they do just fine. We can get them to normal heights. The times when we can't is if it's diagnosed late, or for some reason the treatment is stopped early, or they're given very low doses. But if treated properly, we can get these kids to a normal height. If you have too much growth hormone, so hyperfunction of the pituitary gland, it depends on when this happens, of what you're going to see. If it happens before the growth plates have closed, you're going to get really tall, because it's going to make those long bones grow. This is somebody who can be up to 8 feet tall. They're also going to have a really large head, and that's going to make the fontanelles stay open longer. If it happens after the growth plates have closed, there's no more growth and height that the body can do, so instead it does vertical growth. And this is turns into acromegaly. So generally the weight is in proportion to the height, so it doesn't necessarily cause a person to be heavy, but it will cause that acromegaly, which has a very typical look to it. They get really large head, nose, the jaw gets really large, the teeth don't match right, it has some other increased facial hair and things like that, but the hands and the feet also tend to get really large. So here's some pictures of acromegaly. You can see he's got the really big jaw, kind of the forehead, the nose, everything's big, and these feet. So this is the continued growth even after the growth plates of the long bones have closed. So how are we going to treat this one? Well, we got to figure out why they're producing extra growth hormone. And if it's a tumor on the pituitary gland, we're going to take that tumor out. Or we may irradiate it or put in little radioactive seeds that destroy it. If we destroy the pituitary, though, now we've got to make sure we are replacing the hormones that it controls. One other pituitary issue is precocious puberty, and this is considered puberty that happens earlier than it should. And in boys, that's considered those secondary sex characteristics beginning before age 9. In girls, it's before age 7, and they'll even go down to age 6 on African American girls. They've actually lowered these ages in the last, few years ago, which I just think they're kind of ridiculously low, but that's what we're considering precocious. So we're starting to see secondary sex characteristics before these ages. This happens more in girls than it does in boys. We really usually don't know why, but if we do know why, we're going to treat the cause. And if we don't know why, we can still treat it. We can give, it's a sub-Q injection once a month of Lupron Depot. It will stop the hormones that are causing the precocious puberty. And then when we get to the age where they should start to develop, then we stop that and let their development go on normally. Do think about the psychological impact of this, though. We've got a little girl who should be running around at recess who's now having to deal with having periods. So, this is has a lot of psychological support that both the child and the family are going to need. Diabetes insipidus. This is from the pituitary, from the posterior pituitary, and DI is hypofunction, which means we're not making enough antidiuretic hormone, right? And anti meaning stops. So we're not making the hormone that stops diuresis, so it allows excessive diuresis. So this is uncontrolled peeing. This does sometimes have a familial tendency, but sometimes it's idiopathic. We don't know why. It can also happen from head trauma. Anything that puts pressure on that posterior pituitary, increased intracranial pressure, a tumor, something that's surgery, infection like meningitis or an aneurysm, can all put pressure on that pituitary and cause this to happen. So in anything that has to do with inside the brain, the intracranial pressure, we need to be closely monitoring output, intake and output. So what we're going to see is polyuria and polydipsia, right? The polyuria is what happens from the lack of ADH hormone, and the polydipsia is the body's response. You feel thirsty because you're peeing so much. We replace the hormone with vasopressin. It's also called DDAVP, and it can be sub-Q or as a nasal spray. So the opposite is SIADH, syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. So this is a hyperfunction or hypersecretion of ADH, right? So ADH stops you from peeing, so this stops you from peeing too much. So you're going to retain fluid. What that does, though, is all that extra fluid is thin fluid, and so it's going to dilute your blood. It's not got blood cells in it, right? It's just water and electrolytes and stuff. So we're going to see increased volume and hemodilution. So our cells will actually look a little bit low because we've got all this extra fluid and electrolytes in there. Signs and symptoms of this, certainly watching that intake and output, but anorexia, nausea, vomiting, irritability, personality changes will all occur. And as you correct the ADH, those symptoms will go away. We're going to see low sodium levels, and that is just because we've diluted the blood. We've added a lot of extra water and not as much sodium as water. So you'll see those sodium levels drop. Once that fluid is diuresed off, the sodium levels will be back to normal. So it's dilutional. So we want to treat whatever the underlying condition is. And again, anything that puts pressure on that pituitary gland can cause this. So head trauma or surgery, we've got to be watching for both or either DI or SIADH. So the first thing we're going to do is restrict fluids. We don't want to keep adding IV fluids that have a lot of extra water into the person, or if they're alert enough to be drinking, we don't want to do that. So we're going to restrict fluids first, really monitor their I&O. We've got to be watching for fluid overload, right? Can the heart handle all this extra fluid? Seizure precautions. The brain does not like changes in electrolytes, and it doesn't like movement of fluids and water. And when we get those electrolytes out of whack, water will move into brain tissue, and the brain doesn't like that. So we're going to have to administer something that's ADH antagonizing medicine. So we're going to be giving things to get this person peeing more and creating less ADH. I had to think there for a minute. Yeah, which way it goes. So that's SIADH. Okay, so let's move on to the thyroid. So hypothyroid, so not enough thyroid hormone. And we're just going to limit what we talk about to juvenile hypothyroidism. Your thyroid really controls your basal metabolic rate. So how much, your cells are metabolizing, how much your metabolic demand is just at a normal resting rate. So this can be caused by a number of different defects, but basically you're not making enough thyroid hormone. So if this is in an infant, we've got to treat this very early because the brain is growing. If it's later, we're a lot less worried because the brain is nearly completely done by 2 to 3 years of age. But if we're not having good metabolic rate, that basal metabolic rate, we're going to have delayed brain growth and function, which is going to cause mental retardation in the child at a young age. If it happens later, then we won't see that, which is good. So we're going to treat this by giving them thyroid hormone, and that's an oral medication. In other times, in other countries, it used to be iodine. A lack of iodine was part of the problem, and that is really rare in the United States. That's usually not what causes it. So if we have too much thyroid function, this is called Graves' disease. So now we have increased metabolism. So that basal metabolic rate is ridiculously high. Probably there's an enlarged thyroid gland because they're producing all this thyroid hormone. We're going to destroy some of that thyroid gland. So we can do that by giving an antithyroid drug, surgically removing it, or ablation, which is where they drink a radioactive iodine, and that iodine goes to the thyroid and then damages it. While this kid has these crazy high metabolic rates, they can't meet it. So we need to keep them quiet and calm so their need doesn't go up any higher. So